Welcome everyone. This election season, the Non-Specifics Ministry of Radio is sponsoring a series of voice chat and text-based town halls for each candidate. We hope this event is informative and we encourage you to participate by posting questions in the chat. And now, let's get started. Welcome, McMasterdonia.
Thank you for having me.
Could you give us a brief history of yourself within the region and history of positions that you've held within the regional government?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the North Pacific since late 2011. In 2012, I held my first government position, which was as Minister of Defence. During that time, I was responsible for recreating the modern North Pacific Army. Since that time, I've served in pretty much every position in the executive government in some form or another, although the titles have changed over the years. I've not served in the court or the speaker's role at all, but I suppose the roles that I'm most well known for are my various terms as Delegate of the North Pacific and my terms as Ministers of Foreign Affairs and Defence. So I think that's what I'm known for. Yeah.
Why did you decide to run for delegate again?
Sure, there's quite a few reasons for that. I think the main reason for me personally was throughout this term, I've felt that the current administration has not been living up to the promises that it's made to the people via the last election, that it's not been delivering on even the minimum standards of what we expect from our government. And thirdly, that people have become extremely frustrated with the lack of progress and the lack of leadership that has been shown right from the delegate right through to members of the cabinet. And for that reason, I have been inundated with people coming to me directly to talk to me about these issues. And I've personally tried to raise these issues as well. So I do feel that I have a really good understanding of what the community expects and that I constantly keep my finger on the pulse of that community to make sure that I know what needs to be done, and also that I'm aware of what people see as the problems. So from my position, I feel that this term has really been plagued with issues and it has really demoralized people and the people aren't happy. So from what I was seeing, I felt that I had an obligation to try to correct these issues. And it seemed to me that given the history of previous elections in this region, people are not willing necessarily to challenge an incumbent delegate because they fear that they will lose. And certainly I have no such fear. If I lose, that's fine. But I also believe that I have a very good chance of winning. And I have a very good opportunity to correct the course for this region and to return us to what we should be doing, which is delivering government at the highest possible level and being a world leader in every category. And I don't think we've been able to do that. So look, those are my reasons for running, and I've outlined that in my platform. And I think that if you do want to address the issues that the government is facing and you do want to correct this path that the region is currently on, then there's really only one choice, and that is to support my candidacy, because I don't feel that the current administration is capable of correcting the issues that have arisen this term. And you know, I stand by that, and I think that my campaign will allow us to restore faith from our community members and to make sure that government is working for everyone, which is ultimately the goal.
You've said that there has been some people talking about some problems within the current delegate, which you are currently running against Trumps. What do you do well that you would say that your opponent does not?
Sure. I think, firstly, I would say that I am an excellent listener, which, you know, might seem like a minor thing. However, when I've had issues in my previous administrations, or I've had a minister or, you know, a member of, say, the army or something like that who's not happy with something that's going on, you know, I have a very good ability to have those difficult conversations and to listen to people and to try to find a workable solution. And I think that that is a really useful skill to have. And I've certainly found that I perform the best when I do have ministers and I do have people who are willing to be absolutely direct and to disagree. And I don't think that the current delegate has that ability. Secondly, I think that I have an ability to be really across a lot of issues at once. And, there's not really a particular ministry that I would say is my forte. I feel just as comfortable in the culture ministry as I would in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for instance. So every area will get my attention and every minister will be highly supported and also monitored, because if they're not delivering, then I will make changes. I'm not going to keep the same people there for an entire term if they're not doing the job. So I think those are really the two main skills I would say that will make a difference in how I run the region. Of course, I think there are others. I think my performance over the years has been consistently high. But, not to say that I haven't sometimes let myself down or even let the region down, but overall, I think that people can have absolute faith that the promises I've made, that I will do everything in my power to deliver on them. And I don't think the same can be said for the current administration.
That has been a particular trend within the length of this interview about the current administration's problems. What are exactly those problems that you've seen?
Well, I think firstly, the obvious one that has found its way into the public discourse recently was the complete lack of leadership in the Ministry of Culture. So, there was a minister who was barely active or barely around at all for the entire term. That minister was not replaced. As a result, that work was left to a deputy minister in particular, who wasn't given any leadership or guidance really on how to move that forward, and no changes were made. Secondly, in foreign affairs, I feel that we are losing our ability to be an assertive and proactive voice on the world stage. If anything, I think our foreign affairs this term has been extremely quiet, to the point where it's not being listened to by anyone at all. It's been very insular, and I think that's a real shame. In the Ministry of Defence, we've seen numerous issues, including poor reporting of activities, as we've seen recently, where an op report was posted with no operations included in it. We've seen, what I would describe as a poor handling of that nation state's operation, regardless of what you think of the operation itself. We've also seen an NPA that has been characterised by operations that are primarily piling for other organisations. We've seen a decline in us taking a leadership role in actually leading major operations. We've seen a decline in update activity. We've seen a decline in officers leading operations, and all of these issues have been raised. Now, in other areas, I think the biggest weaknesses I've seen has been a lack of support from the top. So even though the Ministry of Communications, for instance, has been performing pretty well, I think there's been a lack of involvement there from the Chief Executive. And it's all fine and good to appoint ministers, but you do actually need to support them, and you do actually need to help them to facilitate their work to get the best outcomes possible. So those are really the key issues that people have been coming to me. And probably the biggest one, which is across the board, is that they feel that there is an inability to listen to feedback that is received about the government, and an inability to do anything about that feedback. So it seems to go in one ear and out the other.
You've said there has been some problems within the Ministry of Defense, As it stands currently, there is a request for review open within the Court of the North Pacific concerning the supposed illegal actions by partners of the North Pacific Army during joint operations. What opinion do you have upon this issue?
In terms of the legality of the operations?
Upon the conflict that has happened between the members of joint operation within the army and the Ministry of Defense at large, and the supposed problems you have spoken out right now.
Okay, well, with that specific request for review, I think my opinion would be similar to what Gladio has expressed, and that is, generally we follow the rule that we participate in these operations and that our guidelines are followed, especially when we're leading. As to the issues at large, I think, BMW was perfectly within his right to put forward that request for review, and I look forward to hearing the result. But the issues with the NPA and versus the Ministry of Defence, as you've put it, I think has been that the lack of leadership and guidance and the lack of varied operations has meant that there is, I suppose, a morale problem, and there is a lack of trust in the current leadership to correct that. So I think what we need to do is really to take the army back to what it is good at and what it enjoys doing, and that is having an incredibly busy update schedule. And secondly, that the operations give people in our own army the sense that we are actually leading and we are actually the ones making the decisions. We're not simply a support army for other orgs. So I think those things will go a long way to restoring that morale issue that I've outlined. And secondly, there needs to be a change in terms of who is the Minister of Defence. So we need to appoint someone else, and that person needs to be someone who has a track record that is broadly respected across the army. And secondly, someone that has that ability to bring people back together again to restore that faith that has been lost.
There has been a lot of talks on the recent times within the region about transparency. There has been a clear movement within the Security Council to be more transparent. Upon the Speaker office, there has been also some movement to be more transparent. And that leads to the topic of the classification. What do you think of the classification in general, and how can you improve the method on such a thing?
Right. So firstly, the issue with declassification, at least from the executive's point of view, has been that it's been, one of those issues that's just been kicked further and further down the line. So we had administrations who essentially, left office and then left thousands of lines of records just sitting there, I guess without taking any, real action in terms of preparing them for release or anything like that. So when I was last elected delegate, I inherited a lot of records. And I guess my priority at that time was to release the ones that were, not sensitive as quickly as possible, and then to kind of get started on that other process. Admittedly, it wasn't as big a priority as actually leading the executive and, meeting our goals. Obviously, a lot of records have been released this term, which is a positive. However, I would say that, is likely a result of, several people doing it and not just the delegate. So that system, I think, should be the norm moving forward. And that's what I would aim to do. I would aim to, rely upon the chief of staff and perhaps some other, appointed people who would be government officials and bound by their oath to look at those records and prepare them for release. But what I think we need to do moving forward is actually reform the current legal framework around freedom of information. So my point of view is that these records that are created during a delegate's term of office need to be seen as being a responsibility of that delegate to prepare for release. So I guess if I could make a comparison, it would be similar to how a US president has a responsibility for release of records that goes even beyond their term of office. Obviously, there'd need to be checks and balances there, and there would need to be a framework for how that would work should that delegate disappear or be unavailable. But I do think we need to do a bit more work in that space. But that's up to the assembly, I suppose, and not to the delegate to just impose that unilaterally. But certainly what I would hope to do is start with the oldest records first, release those, and then at the end of my term, I will make sure that my records are ready for release when that time frame expires, if I can't release them earlier.
We have begun the interview talking about the reasons you have in order to run for delegate. And within those reasons, you've talked about the current problems that the incumbent, your opponent Plums, has given to the region. Is there something else you would like to say about about your opponent? What are your thoughts in general about your opponent, and not only about their administration at large?
So my thoughts on my opponent personally, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, look, I suppose, personally, Tlums and I have worked together for quite a long time. So I don't have any personal issues with Tlums or anything like that. And we've certainly worked well together in the past. So the only reason, that I have issues with his administration is not personal at all. It's purely about the approach that he's taken as delegate and his actual outcomes for the region, which I don't think have been significant. So I don't hold any ill will towards Sloms or anything like that, although he might towards me. I'm sure it's not easy being challenged like this for your second term. However, yeah, as I've said, I have no personal issues with him, and I'm sure that whoever wins, we would continue to work together as best as we can. But I do hope that if he does win, that he does work incredibly hard to address the issues that have been raised, because I'm not the only one raising them, and we can't keep going with the way things are currently, because it's just not going to work, and it's going to cause even more damage in the long run.
You've talked about your strong points, but we would also like to know your weak points. What do you feel that are your weak points? What do you think they are?
Sure, and this came up in the campaign as well, and I've spoken about it before. I suppose a significant weakness of mine is that I am quite a severe self-critic, and that can be, a bit of a problem sometimes. I guess other issues I've had in the past is not perhaps delegating on the major projects enough. So, for instance, taking on a large amount of responsibility rather than getting ministers to take the lead themselves. However, that changed in my recent term, where I really focused on actually empowering people to take on these projects and feel included, and feel that they could take ownership of them. I would say that I'm also very impatient, which comes out a lot. I mean, I can keep going. It depends how many weaknesses you want to hear from me.
All the ones that you think the people need to know in order to have a well-informed election.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's probably most of them. I guess my style as well, personally, can be pretty direct, assertive, and upfront, and sometimes that rubs people the wrong way. So, for instance, it's come up a little bit recently with 10,000 islands. But look, I think that style is actually useful, and many people actually respect that upfront and direct attitude. But otherwise, I think that's probably all the relevant weaknesses, and I don't want to go on all day about them.
Could you be able to give your platforms in 10 seconds, in 10 words or less?
10 words or less, okay. Like for each ministry or just generally?
Let's try first 10 words for generally and then 10 words for each ministry.
Okay. Generally, I suppose I would say restoring order, activity, prosperity, and faith in the regional government. Then on each ministry, it's a bit of a tough one to think of at 6 o'clock in the morning, but I will do my best.
In the meantime, you think of that. I will ask the next question. Why do you think that voters should look at you and not to Tlums?
I mean, I think I've covered that fairly heavily at the beginning, and I don't want to be flogging a dead horse. I suppose I think people should be looking to me firstly in terms of the platform. It's considerably more comprehensive. It's more detailed. It has tangible activities that will be completed. And I think even if you were just looking at track records over the last year, they're very different. So I think people need to look at my platform and they might think, oh, it's too long or whatever, but they can have faith that these items are actually going to be implemented. So I think even without that, though, the campaigns are very different. And I think mine has a lot more detail. It gives you a really clear rundown on what you can expect from me and from my team. And I don't think that's the same for Tlums.
Whoever wins the election is going to have to face a problem that is within the North Pacific's university. What could you please give us? What ideas do you have for this institution? Is it in need of serious change? What ideas do you have in mind in order for the office of the North Pacific University?
Yeah, so I think the university has been kind of a thorn in the side of a lot of administrations. First it was a public institution, and then it was privatized, and then it was public again, and all of that. So I think, firstly, I would say what the university needs to do is actually remove this complicated bureaucratic structure that has been set up. So things like the university council and all of that I don't think really contribute a lot to the activity of the university. I think it needs to be simplified. Secondly, I think there's more work that we can do in partnership with the other ministries. So we've proposed the card symposium, for instance, if that was to go ahead, and we had written seminars and that kind of thing, we can house them in the university, and that will become a resource over the years. Likewise with communications, what I've tried to do in the past, which didn't have a great deal of success, I think, in my last term, but was working with authors of TNL pieces to see if they're willing to do a Q&A type situation with the wider public. I think that's another way that it could be used. So essentially getting double your money from an article. Otherwise, I think we need to just be realistic about what our expectations are. I think the university is fine for encouraging people to post real life topics and start discussions, but I think we just have to be a bit more realistic and not expect that it's going to be this huge bastion of activity when it's never been that. But yeah, the first step is getting rid of that complicated bureaucratic structure that was imposed by Wondrous, I suppose, and then seeing what we can do from there.
All right. Now it's the time. If anyone in the audience have any questions for the candidates, you can promptly use the Agora text web chat in order to give us the questions, and I will make sure that the candidate answers. So, if anyone has any questions, now it's the time to post them in the Agora text chat. In the meantime, I'm going to give you 60 seconds to say whatever you think it is you think that the audience or the electorate wants to hear, or to say whatever you think you need to say. You have 60 seconds.
Okay, thank you. I think I've covered a lot in the town hall that many people have been wanting to hear for quite a while. I think, firstly, I would say if I am elected, you can be assured that right across the administration, we will be doing everything we can to deliver as many positive outcomes as possible. Secondly, you can be sure that the administration is going to be very open about taking feedback from people, improving things and restoring morale, particularly in the North Pacific Army. And that, as I've outlined, you can have faith that we aren't going to let you down. We're not going to leave ministers there for entire terms not doing their jobs. There will be support from the delegate right through the executive to bringing things back to how they should be. And that's my goal, to restore positive, proactive government so that whoever inherits this office is not inheriting a mess, but they're actually inheriting high-performing government.
Those were the 60 seconds. And we have one question from BMW Surfer, who asks you, do you promise free cookies for dispatch upvotes?
What about free carrot sticks? That seems healthier for a groundhog, right? Not cookies.
The Cascadian Bioregion has a question. What is your opinion on RMB regulation?
So generally my approach to the regional message board is to be fairly, I guess, open-minded. So I'm not a huge fan of suppressing posts willy-nilly, and sometimes I think we do go overboard, and I do actually call the GAs back on that and tell them to relax a little bit. I think we do need to look at some of the ejections and bannings that have been going on, and trying to minimize that as much as possible. So the way I see it is the regional message board is, the first mat to the region that many people will see. So I want it to be active. I want it to be fun. And I guess I want people to feel that they're not going to be overly censored there either. But we do need to keep an eye on it, because every day, there are posts that violate nation states rules and all of that. And the second question.
The second question from the Cascadian Bioregion is, what will be your stance on embassies with other regions?
I don't imagine that there will be changes to the current embassy policy or requirements. I think we would maintain that. However, I do think that there will be some closures because our embassies haven't been reviewed in a while. There are quite a few that haven't had any posts in them on the forum for quite a while, and there are more in-game that have no off-site embassy at all. So I've actually identified that in my platform that I want the foreign minister to do an embassy review and then to propose that list to me for the closures. Now, the last part is that I want us to be more proactive in seeking new embassies. So I think the approach recently has been to simply wait for people to show up on our doorstep. As a result, there are quite a few major regions that we don't, major user creator regions that we don't have embassies with. So I would be working with the foreign minister to actually, get that list together of new embassies and go out and make those new relationships happen.
Oracle has a question which says, if you could make a change to any law within the North Pacific, what would you change? What would you change it to, and why?
Look, there are so many. I think there are two that I'd probably struggle to choose from. The first is the freedom of information changes that I've already talked about, so I won't go into detail about that again. The second one, I think, which I'm sure Vivanco will love, is I think the court should ideally transition to a council or commission style model, so like the Electoral Commission, which means you could have more people appointed as justices, potentially for longer terms. Secondly, the benefit of that system would be you could make some allowances for justices to serve in other roles, so they're not being forced to choose between, doing other government service and being in the court, because other than this term, and perhaps the last term to a lesser extent, the court usually isn't all that busy. So I think people should be able to contribute to a wide range of areas, and I think that would be one way to do that. But I obviously understand that a lot of people will have pretty strong opinions about transitioning away from an elected court, and that's perfectly fine. But I think the model we have now is a result of our constitution originally being based on some Kentuckian piece of legislation or something like that. And it's been modified over time. So I think those changes to the court would probably be the one I would like to see happen the most.
Owen has a question who says, the World Factbook project was an idea of yours from your last term as delegate. Is its evolution and current format something you are happy about? And outside of your spreadsheet idea, are there any changes that you would like to see made?
Look, I think overall, I'm happy that it's still going, and I think it's a really valuable resource. I think the evolution has been slower than I would have liked. I think that the foreign minister and the delegate probably could have been actually writing some of these entries themselves if they weren't satisfied with them. And I understand that some fairly senior members of the diplomatic corps haven't actually done their own entries. So I think there probably needs to be better monitoring of that. I think overall, I know you said other than the spreadsheet, but I think we need the system to be easier to edit. We need it to automatically update as many fields as possible, and I think that will help the system. Secondly, I think we need to actually get it back into the World Factbook entry of our region again, and we need to keep it as being a front and center resource for residents. I don't think that's the case at the moment.
Kratox says, during the last term, we've lost embassies with 10k I and NS. Do you believe this is something we should follow up in any way?
Sure. Yes, I think generally, this isn't a new path for us in 10,000 Islands. And I will say that even when we've had our embassies closed for long periods of time, it hasn't stopped discussions on issues that are, of interest to both of us. So I think as far as 10,000 Islands is concerned, I'm open to continuing to talk to them on those issues, but I'm not going to be proactively seeking to re-establish the embassy, because we did have a huge number of conversations with them in my term about issues on both sides. And I'm not happy with the way this has suddenly came about. And I feel that despite my issues with the current administration, I think the 10,000 Islands approach to closing an embassy is to blindside you with an announcement and not to actually be upfront about their intentions. So I don't intend to reopen that embassy, at least not to personally seek that. With nation states itself, the nation states region, I don't intend to do any follow up on that. I think we probably should have closed that embassy quite a while ago, ideally before we invaded the region.
Bobberino asks, who are you looking at for a cabinet?
Yeah, so interestingly, this question hasn't come up in any of the campaign threads yet. So I'm sure some of you have noticed that. It's pretty unusual that it hasn't been asked. I think, obviously, from what I've said, I probably don't need to say that there's going to be changes, and I'm not going to keep many of the current cabinet. I haven't made a great deal of final decisions on the cabinet itself. What I will say, though, is that I am looking at having a top tier cabinet. So I don't want there to be, any weak areas. There are some new people who came into the region in the last 6 months who I think are really due that opportunity to serve. So the cabinet isn't just going to be all old hands. But what I really want for the cabinet is for it to be high performing, and for it to be consistently so. So that's generally the goals that I'm looking at. But I'd prefer not to start listing names, because I think that can just get a bit complicated during an election.
BMWs ask, as a soldier in the North Pacific Army, what kinds of changes should I be expecting on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So I think on a day-to-day basis, you should expect, firstly, a greater presence from the minister and from the delegate. Secondly, I think you'll see a transition away from this ongoing pile type operations that we seem to be stuck in. You'll see far greater update operations. So these will be ones that are led by us. And it could be, anything from chasing to tag raiding to leading major raids ourselves, but inviting in allies to provide support. So I think in terms of the operational calendar, you'll see that it's considerably better. But other than that, I think we will be doing a much better job of promoting the operations that we do successfully. So what that means is, actually getting those out onto the regional message board, onto nation states gameplay, out as press releases and telegrams, and really trying to leverage that for recruitment. So I think when it comes to recruitment, my view has always been, especially with the NPA, is that sometimes you need to get through, 10, 15, 20 people just so that you find that Gladio or that Bobberino or that BMW, so out of 20, you might get one person who's really consistent for years, but it's worth going to that effort because they do stick around. So I think that's what you'll see on a day-to-day basis. I certainly hope so anyway.
And we have a series of questions put by Ghost, which will be probably the last questions for the town hall. The first question says the following. MCM, you established the committees in the government last time you were delegate, and they had to be discontinued. The incumbent delegate did something similar with foreign affairs. Based on your experience with communities, do you feel this initiative in Foreign Affairs has done better, worse, or about the same as your similar initiative? Is it something you would explore or continue?
Interestingly, this was commented to me privately that I hadn't included it in my campaign. And I will say there's one main reason for that, and that is that I have no idea what that committee is doing. I have no idea of its success. I have no idea what discussions are occurring. So even though I'm a senior diplomat, I don't have access to those discussions. However, my sense is from speaking to people is that it's not doing anything. My position, at least initially, is that I would abolish it, and that it has basically on par with other committee experiences. However, if I, do win the election and I go in and I see, oh wow, this committee is actually really active and it's actually doing a lot of work, I might not abolish it, but I would certainly change, the fact that people have no idea what it's doing. But my initial inclination would be to get rid of it, because if it's not working and it's not doing anything, why would we keep a committee?
The second question is, Trump's UCR outreach program was a big goal for his term as Minister of Foreign Affairs, pursued during Jenny's term as delegate, when I was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then squarely on Trump's shoulders as delegate this term. It's been difficult to explain how it should be set up, and has shown no results. Do you have any thoughts on the program, at least as far as the concept, and is that something you would give a spin of your own as delegate?
I think really the program is a bit of a cop-out because it's a fancy title, but you're right, it hasn't really delivered anything. So I think my approach to UCR outreach is going to be one that's based on actually proactively doing outreach and setting up embassies and establishing those connections, and trying to find ways that we can bring some of these new relationships into our cultural events. So, if we do a card symposium, we might see, are there other UCR regions that have card programs? Are there others that are interested in cards that we don't have relationships with? And then try to bring them in through that way. Otherwise, if we're doing, a role play cultural event with, the South Pacific or the Rejected Realms or something like that, there's no reason we can't invite other UCRs to attend as, new partners of ours. And that's the kind of thing that I would like to do. But I'm probably not going to really call it a UCR outreach program. I think I'm just going to call it, doing the job of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who will be doing this, and things that we should be doing as a matter of routine.
If you had been delegate this term, how would you have approached the challenges some had outlined related to culture and the North Pacific Army?
If I, I think if I had been delegate thing is a bit of a trap that a lot of former delegates fall into. But look, I think I personally feel that I would not have had these challenges. So if 2-3 weeks in, which is the case, the Minister of Culture was not doing his job, I would have asked him to resign, and if he did not do so, I would have replaced him myself. So that would have been the first thing. And I've done that before. I had a Minister of Communications in my first term who didn't do anything for the first 2 weeks. So I asked him to resign and I appointed someone who would do the job. So that's what I would do for culture. For the North Pacific Army, I think I have really high standards because of the fact that my history is in the North Pacific Army. So I would not have tolerated such a long run of piling operations. I wouldn't have tolerated there being no recruitment. So I think if the minister themselves hadn't been capable of delivering on the varied operations that I wanted, I would have replaced them. But I will say on that, I don't think in this case the minister is solely to blame. I think there has been, a lack of support for that minister, who that was his first position in the executive government, and he could have used more support. So I had a new Minister of Defence in Trondheim, but I worked with him very closely so that he was aware of exactly what I expected. And he did deliver that and was one of the best ministers we've had in a long time. So that's how I would have approached it. And certainly if I see that my new appointees are not up to the job, I won't hesitate to replace them.
And the last question from Ghost, is what's something that happened this term that you think went well and should be looked to as an example of how you on how your and future administrators should approach whatever that thing is? Put another way, what would you identify as a key success that would define this administration?
Sure. Okay. I think the obvious one to me is on the communications standpoint. I think that BMW has been very effective at getting the Northern Lights and TNS back to their routine of activities and where they should be. I think he's also been very good at working with other ministries to kind of minimize the workload of having to find other authors. So getting that extra value out of work that's already been done by compiling it into a TNL edition. So I think that's a really key success, and I think that's props to him for doing that.
Right, and that is all of the questions we've had. Thank you very much for attending for this town hall, MCM.
There's one more from Sarah. I think it's just a bit further down.
But we said it will be the Plum since we have another town hall coming in about half an hour, and I have to take my dinner.
Oh, I see. Okay, no problem. I'll move into the Agora then.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you everyone who is in the audience for coming. In half an hour almost, we will be having Kretox town hall, who is running for Vice Delegate. Thank you very much, candidate MCM Macedonia, and good luck on your run for delegacy.